Video games have been in the news lately, with retro games, like a lot of things right now in high demand, being inflated and used games going for astronomically outrageous prices. Madden. Madden? We're finally here where sports games are like 3 times the cost of my rent, but I digress from this hellfire of a world we live in now. I wanted to talk about something we all take for granted. Something that has shaped how games are designed and how we've evolved to play them. Something that if you watch in my last video will understand that implicit memory has had a major impact in how we use other devices that have this same design. And this is it. And you're never going to believe what game started it all. It's not this is brand new. Before we get into the D-pad and its influential design history on gaming, let's talk about what we had before the D-pad, and we're gonna go back to the granddaddy of all controllers. Okay, not that old. Okay, the not so granddaddy, but still pretty close controller of video games. You see, the whole D-pad concept was around for a while. In games you had digital representations of a person, car, or whatever this was on the screen, and you needed to manipulate it with some sort of physical interface device. That was a controller that needed to represent direction or movement. Which if you look at an Atari joystick, you see the arrows and you see the word top. This is a D-pad minus the D-pad. Now, you still see this style in iconography on controllers today, but that original purpose, that design, like I've mentioned in other designs in past videos, has changed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Back then, most games were either top-down or side-scrolling, so the whole left-right, up and down, or northwest, east-south movement was the most ideal design representing those controls. But let's face it, it wasn't a small device. Mind you, this was before handhelds were really a thing, and there were no guidelines or style guides on what a controller should look like. Most of these games were designed for the console and that controller. That's why you had drastic designs back then. Games were totally designed for those controllers, but in reality, the D-pad was a design born for mobile devices. I don't think most people understand that. The D-pad was a mobile-friendly version of the joystick, first and foremost. But it was such a good design, it totally replaced the joystick, at least in home consoles. It also helped to standardize the design of controllers to be more universal, which allowed games to be easily ported to other consoles. I mean, if you look at the big three today, the controllers are pretty much the same. Sure, you have different icons, placements, and extra inputs, but the core 2 sticks, 1 D-pad, 4 face buttons, and 4 shoulder buttons all persist throughout the controller, and I believe, gonna give my own opinion here, the D-pad was because of that. So let's talk about the D-pad, but more importantly, the designer of the D-pad, Gunpei Yokoi. Yeah, he made this. Yokoi came to Nintendo in 1965 and helped to design, develop, and create toys, since Nintendo was more of a toy manufacturer back then. He later was transferred into the engineering department to design and concept ideas for the holidays, and just a side note, one of his first toys was called the Ultra Hand, which I believe sold 1.2 million units, so good for him, your boy rocking Nintendo right off the bat. But it wasn't until Yokoi saw a salaryman playing with his calculator while traveling to work did he have the idea for a handheld gaming device that would pass the time while traveling. And with that epiphany came the Game & Watch. While in development, Yokoi created the principal design language for all Nintendo devices going forward. Lateral thinking with withered technology. And I know that sounds weird, but what he's talking about is technology that was old and cheap, but used in a way that was never thought about before, kind of redesigning the purpose of that technology. You can kind of still see this ideology on the Switch. Even when the device came out, it wasn't the most powerful device on the market, but Nintendo was able to use the strengths of that tech as the foundation to create something we've never seen before in a mass-marketed product. And doing all this while saving a lot of money in development and manufacturing, because that's what Nintendo does. He led the charge that affordability and battery life were more important to a consumer who wanted to purchase a handheld than graphical power. And throughout the Game Boy's life, you saw that he was right about that. Now, back during development, joysticks were the main source of interfaces between the user and the game, but the joystick would have been a flimsy and too large for a pocketable handheld device, so a lot of the first generation Game & Watches used buttons or directional buttons, something we actually see make a comeback on the Joy-Cons today. And that goes into something I mentioned earlier, but first, it wasn't until 1982 when the first D-pad was actually implemented, and it was one of Nintendo's flagship games. And I have an idea why he chose Donkey Kong, but we'll get to that shortly. Now, the D-pad is short for directional or digital pad, and was essentially a compact four-way joystick. Remember, this was designed for mobile. But instead of palm or grip holding, it was designed for the thumb. This was actually a huge innovation at the time, as most Game & Watch devices played on only one axis. Because of the D-pad, you could now play on X and Y axis. And while they did have directional buttons on other devices, Yokoi didn't think the user would understand 4 circle buttons would represent movement. So using iconography, he created a representation of movement for that game. Not only was it a familiar northwest, east-south configuration, it also had arrows built into the D-pad. These arrows represented direction, and it was a stark contrast to the circle buttons opposite the D-pad. This allowed the user to understand instantly the plus was the movement and everything else was a secondary button. I love it when engineers understand design. It also helped that Donkey Kong was a cultural phenomenon and a great choice to utilize this new control style, because people knew the concept behind Donkey Kong. They knew how to move the character. This allowed users to understand the D-pad without ever using or seeing one before. Basically, he did a redesign of the controller for Donkey Kong that actually made sense, unlike a lot of other redesigns in the world lately. And here's the thing, you might be asking yourself, why isn't it on the right if the majority of people are right-handed? The reason might be because of arcade cabinets at the time. Most joysticks were on the left, not the right, and it just kind of stayed that way. In reality, it makes sense. I'm assuming he didn't want to stray too far from what consumers were used to. Remember, the D-pad was a brand new design, and by keeping it on the left, it may have reinforced the idea that this is a joystick, but for mobile devices. The D-pad was such a hit, they used that design in their flagship home console, the Famicom, calling it the Plus Controller Pad and later patenting it in 1985. The D-pad mechanics are quite simple too, a 4-directional switch which can be turned on and off in 4 directions. It has a base plate and a rocker under it with a rubber membrane that connects to the controller to allow movement, which helped to give us a really famous game. Yeah, you kind of know this history. And as I said before, the D-pad also had the indirect responsibility of standardizing controllers. Joysticks were no longer the norm in home consoles, and the massive amount of buttons those older controllers had were slowly disappearing, minus a few holdouts. And while Nintendo did have the patent on the D-pad, which, between you and me, kind of hindered innovation, but that's a story for another video, other console manufacturers worked around those limitations to create their own D-pad. As the D-pad grew in popularity, games grew in different genres. One moment you're playing a side-scroller, the next you're driving a car or flying a fighter jet, all with a D-pad. It allowed jump to be up instead of a dedicated face button, but it could also switch gears or make your fighter jet fly higher. The D-pad went from a mobile-forward design to a universal input device for millions of games. Now, you see D-pads everywhere, from DVD players, smartphones, and going full circle back to calculators. The D-pad even earned a Technology and Engineering Emmy Award, and in 2005, the patent finally expired, allowing other manufacturers to finally use that original D-pad design. I know, crazy, right? The D-pad was so influential in game development, famously, Microsoft had to redesign the D-pad on their 360 controller mid-console release. And while the D-pad has fallen out of favor for the analog sticks, the D-pad has seen a resurgence in new retro handheld devices like the Retroid Pocket Go. But that aside, the D-pad has now become the tertiary device. Much like how the buttons were the secondary device when the D-pad became the standard form of movement, the face buttons have kind of replaced the D-pad. And it's kind of poetic. Nintendo was one of the first companies to sideline the D-pad, starting with the N64 controller. The analog stick was the hero of that generation, leading with Mario 64, we had a new standard on how avatars would be controlled on screen. And while the D-pad is still around and probably will never fully go away, its history and its importance seem to be slowly vanishing from our minds. With touch interface, VR, and analog sticks slowly taking over controller interfaces, that D-pad has become more and more irrelevant. It's to the point where we use it to look at a map or quick select items. Its meaning, its purpose, no longer represents that original design. I think that's why the Joy-Con uses circles, because the D-pad really isn't a directional interface anymore. Minus those retro games. So what do you guys think about the D-pad? For the younger generation, did you know that it was a directional pad for controlling your avatar? And for the older generation, do you miss it? Or are you happy with the analog sticks? What was the first controller you ever picked up? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, thanks for watching, I'll check you guys later.